I discovered something about you that changed everything. Not in a dramatic moment, not through a confession or sudden realization, but through a quiet pattern, a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm that kept repeating until it became impossible to ignore. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It didn't demand attention. It revealed itself slowly, the way real truth always does, slipping past the noise of everyday life until its presence could no longer be questioned. I wasn't looking for it. That's the part that matters most. When you are searching for meaning, you tend to manufacture it. You strain to find significance in the wrong places, to craft connection out of fragments. But when you are not looking, when your mind is free of expectation, meaning has a way of showing up on its own terms. That's exactly how it appeared. Quietly, naturally, without effort, without demand. And that is why it mattered. What I discovered wasn't about what you said. It wasn't about a single phrase, a joke, or a compliment. It was about what didn't change, the constancy beneath everything else, the unwavering presence that existed not because it was noticed, not because it was praised, but because it simply was. I noticed it during ordinary moments, moments when the world was dull and routine, when nothing seemed remarkable, conversations that didn't lead anywhere, silences that didn't need to be filled, days where nothing special happened. And yet, beneath all of that, something stayed the same. Your presence didn't fluctuate with mood. Your tone didn't bend under circumstance. You didn't perform warmth, you embodied it quietly. Most people can maintain a version of themselves when life is exciting. They can shine when there is applause, when momentum carries them forward, when attention is abundant. Very few people remain themselves when there's no external pressure, when the world is ordinary, when there is nothing to compel them to perform. You did. That realization shook me quietly because it revealed something fundamental, not about attraction, not about chemistry, but about alignment, about what it means to exist alongside someone whose inner rhythm mirrors your own. I realized that being connected to you didn't create urgency in me. It created calm. Calm sharpened my thinking. Calm simplified decisions. Calm removed noise I hadn't even realized I was tolerating. That kind of effect doesn't come from chemistry alone. Chemistry excites. Chemistry ignites. Alignment sustains. Alignment is the quiet hand that steadies, the invisible architecture beneath action. You didn't pull me away from myself, you anchored me closer to it. When something disrupts your direction, you feel scattered. When something aligns with it, you feel focused. That focus isn't forced, it isn't performative, it isn't the adrenaline of novelty or the thrill of desire. It is a stillness that sharpens perception, that filters thought, that clears the space to observe reality as it is. I felt focused. And that wasn't accidental. It changed how I saw everything. I stopped wondering what something could become and started noticing what it already was. I stopped asking how things felt and started observing how they functioned. And what I saw was stability without stagnation, depth without heaviness, presence without pressure. That combination is rare. Most people mistake intensity for significance. They confuse noise with meaning, passion with reliability, drama with depth. But the truth is the opposite. Stability carries weight. Presence carries trust. Alignment carries momentum without strain. I discovered that I didn't feel the need to secure your attention. I didn't feel compelled to prove myself, to perform, to persuade. I didn't adjust my pace to maintain interest or chase approval. That absence of anxiety was the clearest signal of all. Security doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't manipulate or bend to circumstance. It settles. It whispers. And the world listens because it trusts that it is complete in itself. You didn't make me want to move faster. You made me want to move accurately. Accuracy matters when something has weight. Precision matters when something has value. You don't rush weight, you respect it. You don't perform precision, you honor it. And that respect changed everything. It reshaped how I moved through my own days, how I evaluated my own choices, how I prioritized what was essential and discarded, the superfluous. I noticed how you handled space, not just physical space, but the space of interaction, the space of expectation, the space of silence. You didn't treat distance as a threat. You didn't fill silence with assumption. You allowed things to exist as they were. You allowed moments to breathe without panicking about what they meant. That told me you weren't chasing reassurance. You weren't attempting to bend reality to fit expectation. You were grounded in yourself. Grounded people don't cling, they don't demand, they choose. That's what I saw. That's what I learned without anyone explaining it, without any demonstration, without instruction. Presence does not announce itself. It reveals itself in patterns, in the spaces between words, in the way silence is held and respected. I discovered that you didn't need to be seen constantly to remain present. Your presence wasn't performative. It didn't rely on validation. It was steady. That steadiness isn't something that can be faked. It comes from awareness, from integrity, from a system of being that is consistent regardless of circumstance. I learned that the most important discoveries aren't about attraction. They aren't about intensity, about sparks, about fireworks. They are about compatibility of rhythm, about how two people move through time when no one is directing them. Your rhythm didn't clash with mine. It complemented it. It created a trajectory that was organic, self-sustaining, and powerful without force. It taught me to stop thinking in terms of moments and start thinking in terms of systems. Systems that hold under pressure. Systems that thrive during silence. Systems that behave predictably under misalignment and uncertainty. I discovered that you didn't create emotional noise to feel close. You didn't escalate to manufacture intensity. You didn't withdraw to feel powerful. You stayed consistent. That consistency rendered everything else unnecessary. Drama fades. Structure endures. Stability has power. Presence has influence. Alignment carries more weight than desire ever could. And in observing this, I began to understand that the world is filled with people chasing intensity, mistaking it for significance, mistaking excitement for depth. But what lasts is coherence, and coherence is rare. I also realized that what changed everything wasn't a single quality. It was the absence of instability. No emotional spikes, no unpredictable shifts, no pressure to define things prematurely, just clarity unfolding at its own pace. That's when I knew something had shifted. I didn't feel pulled forward by desire. I felt held in place by understanding. Understanding doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It waits until it is complete before it moves. And when understanding arrives, it stabilizes everything it touches. I discovered that this understanding didn't make life louder. It made it quieter. And quiet is where truth lives. It is where observation becomes insight. It is where the subtleties of human nature, of connection, of alignment, can finally be recognized. This quiet doesn't need defending. It doesn't need exaggeration. It doesn't need urgency. It functions independently of circumstance, without fanfare or performance. Once you recognize something that functions this way, you can't unsee it. You stop mistaking intensity for connection. You stop tolerating anything that requires constant management. You start choosing differently. I discovered something about you that changed everything. Not because it overwhelmed me, not because it was dramatic or conspicuous, but because it made sense. And when something makes sense at this level, it deserves to be approached with care, not rushed, not tested, not forced. Simply understood. If you are listening to this, and you feel the difference between something that excites you and something that steadies you, then you understand exactly what I'm describing. You felt that shift too, quietly, deeply. And if this resonates with you, if clarity over chaos is something you recognize, you feel that recognition in your body, in your mind, in the way your focus sharpens, in the way your attention steadies. This is the beginning of understanding. When I reflect on it, what struck me most was how effortless it felt to exist alongside you. Not in a careless way, not in a way that minimized responsibility, but in a way that made clarity the default state. I wasn't constantly measuring, constantly interpreting, constantly decoding signals. I didn't feel the need to anticipate your reactions or strategize my responses. That absence of tension, it was as rare as it was profound. In most interactions, even the ones that feel comfortable, there is an undercurrent of calculation. People measure, they hedge, they adjust. But with you, there was no adjustment necessary. I didn't need to perform, and I didn't feel compelled to predict. I could simply be, and that being was met with the reality of you, not expectation, not negotiation, not performance. And that led me to notice how subtle patterns matter more than grand gestures. Everyone notices the obvious, the words that dazzle, the moments that flash brightly and disappear. But true understanding, true resonance, lives in repetition, in consistency, in the quiet moments where no one is paying attention. It lives in the way you act, when there's no audience, when no one is watching, and the stakes are minimal. That's where character resides. That's where the integrity of a person is revealed. I began observing these patterns, almost without realizing it. At first, it was incidental, noticing how your tone didn't falter during mundane conversation, how your presence didn't waver when plans shifted, how patience wasn't conditional. Then I started seeing it everywhere. In the way you spoke to people who couldn't offer you anything in return, in the way you carried yourself when attention wasn't on you, in the way you didn't let frustration dictate your words or behavior. It was everywhere, subtle, consistent, undeniable. And that consistency began to change me. I realized I had been tolerating inconsistency in others for too long. I had accepted fluctuation as normal, drama as inevitable, noise as unavoidable. But witnessing this steadiness, I began to understand the difference between noise and signal, between chaos that masquerades as depth and alignment that functions quietly, powerfully, and without effort. Stability doesn't seek approval. It doesn't try to impress. It doesn't create urgency artificially. Stability exists. And once you see it, once you recognize it, it becomes impossible to settle for anything less. I noticed how your energy didn't spike with excitement or collapse with disappointment. It stayed steady. And that steadiness created a mirror in me. I didn't feel compelled to perform or exaggerate. I didn't feel the need to chase or for CE connection. I could simply engage, and engagement itself became sufficient. There was no anxiety, no uncertainty, just presence, just clarity, just trust. Trust. That's the word that keeps surfacing. I realized that trust doesn't require constant validation. It doesn't require checks, reassurances, or tests. Trust, in its deepest form, grows from observation over time. It grows from repeated experiences that demonstrate reliability, coherence, and alignment. And when I observed you, when I allowed myself to notice without distraction or expectation, trust wasn't something I had to choose consciously. It simply emerged. I noticed how you handled conflict. Not just the absence of it, but the presence of it. Not in the abstract, but in the small disagreements that could have escalated but didn't. You didn't escalate to assert power. You didn't withdraw to manipulate. You stayed present. You listened. You responded without aggression. You allowed space for resolution rather than control. That approach is rare, and it forced me to rethink the way I had navigated tension in my own life. I began to see that calm resolution is stronger than loud persuasion, that patience is more effective than urgency, that alignment is more durable than intensity. And then I noticed the way you treated time. Time isn't neutral, of course, but most people behave as if it were either a resource to hoard or a weapon to wield. You, however, treated it differently. You didn't rush it. You didn't manipulate it to create pressure or demand results. You allowed it to unfold. You allowed moments to arrive naturally and decisions to mature without forcing them prematurely. Time with you is measured not by the urgency of outcome, but by the quality of experience. That patience isn't passive. It is active understanding. It is a recognition that life is not a sprint, and that things of value require consistency, not speed. I discovered that I didn't feel the need to orchestrate interaction with you. I didn't need to prompt conversation, manage attention, or engineer connection. I could simply exist, and connection followed naturally. That was revolutionary in its subtlety. In most relationships, we spend energy managing appearances, manipulating perception, and calibrating responses. But with you, the system was self-sustaining, effortless alignment, organic presence, invisible architecture. It was remarkable because it wasn't designed to impress. It simply existed. And the power of that truth is difficult to overstate. I began noticing small, almost imperceptible, details that revealed even more. The way you remembered minor facts about people without effort. The way you followed through on commitments when no one else cared. The way you maintained integrity even when convenience suggested otherwise. These weren't acts of performance, they were manifestations of being. And that, more than anything, demonstrated to me that true value exists in what cannot be faked. Integrity evident, not in grand gestures, but in repeated, subtle consistency. And observing that consistency revealed a reality I had not fully grasped before. Stability breeds trust. Trust breeds clarity. Clarity enables alignment. Alignment transforms everything. I began to notice my own transformation in response. I didn't realize how much of my attention had been spent managing the unpredictable, the performative, the inconsistent. Once I saw what stability looked like, I recognized how much energy I had been wasting in other contexts. I felt liberated, freed from the need to perform, freed from the anxiety of uncertainty, freed from the false urgencies that often dominate human interaction. That freedom was its own revelation. And then I noticed the interaction between our presences, the way coherence creates systems beyond individual action. You didn't just act consistently, your actions created an environment where coherence naturally emerged. Interactions became predictable, not in the sense of being boring, but in the sense of being reliable. Emotional spikes faded, noise diminished, drama became unnecessary. This wasn't something imposed, it was emergent. The environment itself changed because alignment is contagious. It spreads through observation, through reflection, through example. I realized that this pattern of alignment is rare because it requires internal discipline, self-awareness, and understanding of cause and effect within human interaction. Most people cannot maintain it because it demands constancy, not just in moments of significance, but in every ordinary interaction. You cannot be reliable only when convenient. You cannot demonstrate integrity only when rewarded, and you cannot build trust only when attention is focused. All of it must persist, constantly, subtly, invisibly, and that is exactly what I saw. That is exactly what I discovered. And the effect was cumulative. It wasn't the impact of a single moment or a dramatic intervention. It was the effect of repetition, of observing patterns over time. Each moment confirmed the last, each interaction reinforced the previous. Stability compounded, coherence amplified, trust crystallized. And in witnessing this, I realized that what changes everything is rarely what is loud or conspicuous. It is what exists, reliably, quietly, under the surface, regardless of recognition. It is in this context that I began to understand a new framework for human interaction. Not all relationships are equal. Not all connections are sustainable. Some are built on intensity, excitement, or volatility, and they burn bright before fading. Others are built on alignment, consistency, and quiet presence, and they endure. This distinction transformed the way I evaluated every interaction around me, not just with you, but with the world. It made me selective, intentional, and discerning, and that discernment wasn't cold, it was liberating. I discovered that connection, at its most profound, isn't created through chemistry alone. It isn't manufactured through performance or engineered through manipulation. It emerges when alignment exists between rhythm, values, and intention. It emerges when presence is reliable, energy is consistent, and integrity is observable. And that connection, once recognized, cannot be overlooked, cannot be dismissed, and cannot be replicated through superficial measures. That realization is rare, and observing it in you was a revelation because it revealed a system that functioned independently of circumstance. It wasn't dependent on performance, on urgency, or on expectation. It existed quietly, steadily, and powerfully, regardless of whether it was noticed. And that is how I realized what truly changes everything. Not drama, not chemistry, not intensity, but coherence, alignment, and the subtle, consistent practice of being. By this point, I had observed enough to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't fleeting. It wasn't excitement disguised as depth. It wasn't novelty mistaken for connection. It wasn't the performance of warmth or attentiveness. What I saw was fundamentally structural. It was the architecture of presence, trust, and alignment. And observing it revealed something profound, not just about you, but about myself, about how I had been moving through the world, and about what true connection requires. I realized that I had spent far too long accepting relationships that required constant attention, constant validation, constant management. I had settled for intensity over stability, for excitement over alignment, for temporary attraction over long-term coherence. And in watching you, I began to understand that those choices had cost me more than I realized. They had fragmented my energy, scattered my focus, and conditioned me to chase moments rather than systems. Your presence didn't chase me. It didn't demand. It didn't manipulate. And yet, it commanded everything that mattered. This revelation forced me to reconsider the meaning of influence. Most influence is loud. Most influence is external. It demands attention, forces engagement, and relies on the reaction it provokes. But true influence, the kind that changes how a person moves through the world, doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It exists quietly. It stabilizes. It orients. It reveals patterns without explaining them. And once you see that influence, it transforms your internal landscape, whether you intend it to or not. I noticed how every interaction with you had a gravitational effect, not one that pulled me artificially, but one that centered me. It didn't create pressure. It didn't demand performance. It didn't require me to impress, prove, or explain. It simply anchored me. And in that anchoring, I began to see everything with new clarity. I started recognizing patterns in myself that had gone unnoticed, the small ways I adapted to inconsistency, the subtle strategies I employed to navigate unpredictability, the energy I spent managing perception instead of focusing on essence. All of that fell away in your presence. I began to see the world differently. When stability exists alongside you, unpredictability becomes obvious. When coherence is present, misalignment becomes stark. When trust is earned structurally rather than emotionally, artificial intensity loses its power. And the more I observed this, the more I recognized how rare it truly is. Not rare because people cannot be consistent, but rare because it requires intention, awareness, and the courage to exist without performative reward. That is not a common combination. That is extraordinary. I also noticed how your presence influenced my own behavior in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became more deliberate. I became more patient. I became aware of how I allocated attention and energy. I noticed that I wasn't chasing connection or managing perception. I could trust the system of alignment that had emerged naturally between us. And that trust changed how I moved through every other interaction, every other choice. I began valuing coherence over chaos, subtlety over spectacle, structure over drama. The standards by which I measured the world shifted, because I had seen what is possible when alignment is allowed to exist fully, consistently, and without interference. I realized that presence isn't just about being. Presence is about creating conditions where being is enough. Presence stabilizes energy. Presence communicates reliability. CE signals safety without words. And once you recognize it, once you internalize it, you understand how many of the anxieties and frictions in human interaction are unnecessary. They are artifacts of inconsistency, of unpredictability, of misalignment. And observing that you operated outside of those artifacts, I began to understand the extraordinary nature of quiet consistency. I began to observe small, repeating patterns that revealed the depth of this alignment. How you responded when people faltered, not with judgment, not with manipulation, but with measured understanding. How you maintained integrity even when it was inconvenient. How patience was your default state, not a choice. How silence wasn't uncomfortable, but an instrument for clarity. How energy remained even, consistent, reliable, and never forced. Each of these observations accumulated into a realization. Stability is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and powerful. Stability informs decision-making. Stability allows presence. Stability sustains alignment. And once you recognize it in someone else, it becomes impossible to accept less in yourself. You begin to demand the same coherence, the same alignment, the same quiet consistency, not as a performance, but as a standard of existence. I realize that trust, when built this way, doesn't require verification. It doesn't require rehearsal or repeated testing. Trust is structural. It is earned through repeated evidence of alignment, not through emotional intensity or dramatic displays. And because trust emerged naturally between us, it no longer felt like a choice, it was a state. It was a presence. And that presence transformed how I approached not just our interactions, but every other element of life. I noticed how freedom emerges from stability. When you are anchored, you are not constrained. You do not need to manage outcomes, engineer impressions, or predict every response. You can simply exist, and your existence carries meaning. And observing that freedom, I began to understand how much of human energy is wasted managing noise that doesn't matter, compensating for instability that isn't inherent to life, and negotiating space that should be given freely. Your presence allowed me to release all of that. And then I saw how patience functions when alignment is present, not the patience of waiting anxiously, but the patience of knowing that processes unfold in their own time, that repetition builds durability, that patterns eventually reveal themselves without coercion. That kind of patience is rare. It is cultivated by consistent alignment, structural integrity, and steady energy. And watching it unfold in your behavior was both enlightening and transformative. I realized that the effect of this alignment isn't dramatic. It doesn't demand attention. It isn't measured by applause, recognition, or reaction. Its power is subtle, cumulative, and deep. It changes how decisions are made. It changes how priorities are set. It changes how focus is maintained. It changes how energy is distributed. And once you witness that, once you feel it, once it becomes visible through the quiet consistency of someone's presence, you cannot unsee it. I discovered that connection at this level doesn't need to be proven. It doesn't need to be tested. It doesn't need to be defended. It exists in the regularity of behavior, the constancy of energy, and the subtle architecture of alignment. And once you recognize it, you begin to reevaluate every relationship, every interaction, every decision that had previously felt uncertain or unstable. You begin to prioritize coherence, trust, and alignment over intensity, novelty, and chaos. And that reevaluation is transformative because it isn't superficial. It changes the way you inhabit the world. I realize that principles are more durable than moments. Systems are more reliable than gestures. Alignment is more powerful than chemistry. And observing these principles in action in you, I began to understand the quiet, unspoken rules of relationships that endure. Trust emerges from consistency. Respect is built through boundaries. Energy stabilizes through presence, and understanding arises through observation. And finally, I realized that what changed everything wasn't the discovery itself. It was the recognition of a system functioning perfectly without interference. Nothing collapsed. Nothing needed to be coerced. Nothing required explanation. Everything held. Holding matters, stability matters, alignment matters. And that realization of coherence, of calm, of steady presence, changes not just how you interact with another person, but how you inhabit your own life. This understanding shifted my approach to everything: decisions, priorities, relationships, even how I measured my own energy and attention. I no longer tolerate unpredictability disguised as significance. I no longer mistake intensity for connection. I no longer expend effort to manage noise that is unnecessary. I prioritize alignment, coherence, and steady presence, because that is what truly sustains. And in recognizing all of this, I discovered the rarest truth of all: the moments that appear quiet and ordinary often hold the deepest power. The moments that do not demand attention, the moments that require no applause, the moments that repeat consistently over time. These are the moments that define reality. These are the moments that transform life. These are the moments where trust is earned, stability is established, and alignment becomes undeniable. I discovered something about you that changed everything, not because it overwhelmed me, not because it dazzled or forced recognition, but because it made sense. Because it revealed a system, a structure, a coherence that functioned without drama, without manipulation, without performance. And once you witness that, once you internalize that, once you understand its implications, life cannot remain the same. You cannot unsee stability. You cannot unexperience alignment. You cannot forget coherence. And that is what remains: the quiet principle that guides decisions, the steady presence that anchors energy, the clarity that informs action. It is not loud, it is not urgent, it does not demand recognition. It simply is. And once you recognize it, once you feel it, it changes everything.